but perhaps some of it will be practical for changing our own actions, if not for changing the divine mind. The question of whether God's mind can be changed comes up in Bereshit in the very beginning. The foundational stories of the beginning are full of the contrast between God's deliberate planned actions of creation and what happens when God encounters the human beings that God created. It's expressed most clearly at the end of the first Parsha in Bereshit, in Genesis 6:6, when we read, Vayinachem Adonai ki asa et ha'adam. And God regretted or repented or was comforted for having created human beings. Okay, I'm going to switch to the text. Hopefully we can do this pretty efficiently. Okay, if you are following and have your own text, I will be going pretty much in straight in order. So so the first text here is consideration of or these first couple of texts. Imagine God recognizing an error in creating human beings in a particular way. So God says, you know, maybe whoops, sorry. God says maybe I should have created, you know, it's good I created him out of earthly elements. If I created him out of heavenly elements, God would not have, the people would not have rebelled against me. All these ways in which God is kind of saying, I made a mistake, but it could have also been worse. I do want to, God had a plan for humanity. But clearly God's plans needed to be changed. Human beings' behavior is the first thing that forces God to change the divine mind. If we look at text A5, it does lay out a philosophical question which is going to remain with us through the text. How can it be that an all-seeing, all-knowing God has regrets and by implication might need to change the divine plan? The answer is, in this particular Midrash, that God sees all and doesn't change God's plan, but that God experiences and acts in the present. At the moment before the flood, God has to mourn. So the example is given that when we have children, we know that eventually they're going to die, just as we will. But we still have children, and we still rejoice, gladness at a time of gladness and mourning at a time of mourning. So I wanted to bring this midrash to raise the issue that that not everybody is going to agree that God actually changes God's mind. But I think the more interesting midrashim are those in which God changes God's mind. If we move to, I'm going to move to text B, I think, yes. Okay. This midrash returns to the idea that God had a plan. God's original plan was immortality for human beings. But from the beginning, the angel of death offers a challenge to God. Why was I, the angel of death, created for no purpose? God explains to the angel of death that eventually there are going to be idolaters who will be subject to the angel of death. But once again, from Adam on, human beings, by their corrupt deeds, force God to change the divine mind and plan. I want to stop for a few minutes to step out of the purely divine realm into something that perhaps is a little more practical. Our texts go back and forth between God's plan for individuals and God's plans for the Jewish people and for the world. Presumably, God has given us as individuals free will. God's plan is reward for the good and punishment for evil. Even though we set our fate according to God's plan when we sin, it seems that it's built into God's plan our ability to change God's mind about our ultimate outcome. So at least in this in this way of looking at the question of how do we change God's mind, I am going to suggest that God built the world, and this is certainly one of our teachings around the high holidays, right? God created the world with repentance as a foundation, so that we do, in essence, have the opportunity to change God's mind. And this text is going to hopefully have a familiar piece to it. If you're following on your own sheet, I'm up at text C. The methodology of how we change God's mind, right? How do we consider how to repent so that you can be delivered from the doom of Gehinnom? Rabbi Yudin said in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, 3 things annul decrees. They are prayer, tefillah, charity, tzedakah, and repentance, tshuva. And there's a proof text here that they're actually all found together in one verse. And Rabbi Mana adds to this that fasting can be effective in our having an impact on God's plans for us. During the month of Elul in our synagogue, there are going to be so many classes, and I'm sure that these particular themes are going to be explored further. Okay. The first clear attempt by a human being to deliberately change God's mind is Abraham trying to convince God not to destroy the inhabitants of Sodom. There are certainly many midrashim exploring this encounter. What was God's intention and what was Abraham's methods in trying to get God to change his mind? Although in this case, Abraham apparently fails to change the divine mind, I do believe that this text is a foundational model for Jewish responsibility to argue with God at times. I'm not really spending a lot of time on the Abraham text. We're going to look at some other ones. But there's an interesting text which is set in this argument between God and Abraham, and it offers another action which human beings can take, at least at a time when we have a Beit HaMikdash, to change God's mind. And you'll see in the underlined section where it says text D1 that that Abraham refers to himself as being dust and ashes, and in this we now get a teaching that God has given us sacrifices which get burnt. The sin offering and the purification offering gets burnt, and you have ashes. And we know that these sacrifices were something by which we could get atonement, and atonement is one of the ways in which we change God's mind. Text D2 at the top of page 3 tells us how a public fast was accomplished. And the ritual of a fast, the ark would be brought out into the public square of the town, and burnt ashes were sprinkled on the ark. And there's 2 different opinions about what we're supposed to remember with the ashes. Are we supposed to remember Abraham, who argued for Sodom? And in arguing for Sodom, he said, I'm but dust and ashes. But the other teacher says that the ashes are to remind us about Isaac. And if you're not familiar with this, there are some midrashim which say that Isaac was actually killed and burnt on the altar and then resurrected. So in any event, fasting and the use of ashes reminds us of the sacrifices and remembering the patriarchs, and these are all things which have the power to change God's mind. Text E returns us to a way of changing God's mind, which is accessible to all of us. And it should be familiar to you from Ashrei, from Psalm 145, right? Tov Adonai lakov rachamav al kol ma'asav. The Lord is good to all, and his tender mercies are over all his works. And I actually, when I was looking at this text, I really came to love it. Because it says to us, the Lord is good to all, his tender mercies are over all, for it is his nature to be compassionate. And Rabbi Joshua taught in Rabbi Levi's name, the Lord is good to all, and he inspires humankind with his spirit of compassion. And here's the proof text about the fact that we can change God's mind. Should a year of famine commence tomorrow, and men show compassion to each other, then the Holy Blessed One will also be filled with compassion for them. So I just think it is a beautiful text. None of these ways of human beings changing God's mind that at least I'm sharing with you from the Midrash are a, people would say it's not a vending machine here. It's not as if you put something in, you get it out. But in the Midrashic stories, they at least suggest this. And so now we get an example of a fast that happened in the days of Rabbi Tanhuma. So they proclaimed a fast, right? That was something that they did in the past. Some people have actually suggested that maybe we as a community need to proclaim a fast for what we're going through now. But he proclaimed the fast for one day, a second day, a third day, and no rain fell. And Rabbi Tanhuma ascended to the pulpit and he preached to the people, be filled with compassion for one another. And so they were actually filled with compassion for one another, and they behaved that way, except on a certain level. They saw a man giving money to his divorced wife. And you might say, like, what bothered everybody about that? The idea was that the gossip, the bad thoughts about this man was that he was actually paying his former wife for having sex, even though they were no longer married. So Rabbi Tanhuma said, what's the issue? People said, we saw him giving money to his divorced wife. Rabbi Tanhuma called the man over. He said, why did you do this? The man said, I saw her in great distress. I was filled with compassion for her. Then Rabbi Tanhuma turned his face to heaven and said, Sovereign of the universe, this man upon whom this woman has no claim for sustenance, yet saw in her distress and was filled with pity for her. So you too, God, right? You too. Please be gracious and compassionate. While we, your children, the children of your beloved ones, the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, how much more so should you be filled with compassion for us? And immediately the rain descended and the world enjoyed relief. So I think every time we hear Ashrei now, we're going to remember and hopefully be encouraged to be compassionate, because that should be good for us. I want to spend some time on a relationship that we began the fall season with, the relationship between God and Moshe. We're going to look at the most significant biblical moment when a human being changed God's mind. Perhaps. Could Moshe keep God from destroying the people after the golden calf? I'm going to begin with a midrash which states that God did want Moshe to change the divine mind. So if you remember the story of the golden calf, when God informs Moshe of what happened, he says to him, let me alone, let my wrath wax hot against them, that I may consume them. Now, it's kind of a strange thing, the Midrash says. Why does God say, now therefore let me alone? Was Moses holding God somehow? And they give the example of a king who was angry with his son, and the son was brought into the chamber and about to be beaten. The king cried from the chamber, let me alone that I may smite him. Now the instructor of the son happened to be standing outside the room and thought to himself, if both the king and the son are the only ones in the chamber, why is the king saying, let me alone? It must be because the king is desirous that I should entreat him on his son's behalf. And for this reason, the king says, let me alone. And similarly, God said to Moses, thou therefore let me alone. And I lost myself. Okay, hang on. Therefore, let me alone. And and immediately Moses inferred God wants that I should intercede with him on Israel's behalf. And hence God is saying, therefore, let me alone. And right away, Moshe began to plead for mercy on their behalf. Now, so we have seen, you could actually read the Abraham text too and say, did God at least want the possibility of being convinced to change his mind when he tells Abraham his plans? And here you could say the same thing. I don't think that it is guaranteed, right? Even if you take that first midrash here, where God says, God says, let me alone means try to stop me. I don't think that it's guaranteed that Moshe will be able to stop God. I think Moshe still has a role in changing God's mind. And this next text G, um, in fact says that. I think this midrash isn't sure that God wants to be moved from the plan of destruction. God feels betrayed by the Jewish people. Moshe really has to work hard, and he has to use multiple arguments to try to dissuade God from destruction. And so we see a few of those, arguments, right? Remember, the Jewish people, they did follow you, they did accept the Torah, and they believed in you. But it's not until Moshe gets to the final part of his argument, as the Torah structures things after the golden calf, um, and um, and here Moshe reminds God of the promise to the patriarchs, the covenant that God made with their descendants, that they would be like the stars of the sky. When nothing else works, we turn to this reminder to avert destruction. And this also is something that we see a lot and use liturgically throughout the days of awe. When we cannot stand on our own accomplishments, on our own beliefs, on our own arguments, we turn to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and we say to God, you made them a promise. You are stuck. The next two midrashim are, they take us to places where Moshe's intervention is on a very different level, and I love these. Text I talks about Moshe being a good advocate and presenting his case clearly and compellingly, right? This is one of the tasks when you have to try to convince somebody of something. You need to present a cogent case, and it references two men, Daniel in some other case and Moshe, who set their face against the attribute of strict justice in order to plead for mercy on Israel's behalf. So the advocate has a very important task. But Moshe takes it a step further in the second half of the midrash. He takes an audacious step. He smashes the tablets. Those were God's own work, and Moshe smashes them on the ground. If the people didn't know the punishment, is what Moshe figures, if they didn't know that the punishment for idolatry was destruction, then God cannot punish the people with destruction. So that Moshe is prepared to destroy God's work in order to save the people. And I think it's a very powerful reading of the text. But the next one is even more audacious. So I think I'm gonna we have a little bit of time. I'm gonna read most of it. So Rabbi Brechia said in the name of Rabbi Chalbo, who said it in the name of Rabbi Isaac, that Moses absolved the creator of his vow, approve? When Israel made the calf, Moses began to persuade God to forgive them. But God said, Moses, I've already taken an oath. He that sacrifices unto the God shall be utterly destroyed. So God is basically saying, because I wrote this in the Torah, it's an oath. I cannot retract an oath which has proceeded from my mouth. Moses rejoined, Lord of the universe, didn't you grant me the power of annulment of oaths by saying when a man vows a vow to the Lord or swears an oath to bind his soul with a bond, he shall not break his word? That is, the person themselves cannot break the word, but a scholar can absolve a person of his vow if he consults him. And that's actually a practice that continues to exist today and is in some communities undertaken before Rosh Hashanah. If a scholar pronouncing a decisions is desirous that others should respect his decision, he must first observe it. Since you, continued Moses, has commanded me concerning the annulment of vows, it's only right and proper that you should annul your vow as you commanded me to annul the vows of others. Right? That in itself is I think an audacious reading, but now the Midrash is going to go on. Whereupon Moses wrapped himself in a cloak and seated himself in the posture of a sage, and God stood before him as one asking for the annulment of his vow, for it says, Then I sat on the mountain. Now, is it possible that Moses should sit and God, blessed be his name, should stand? Come back. Should stand. Rabbi Dossi says, no, it's just really how you're seeing it. But because, said Rab Huna, what did Moshe say to God? And it's a hard thing. Rabbi Yochanan says the hard thing was, Moshe says this to God, do you now regret your vow? And the reply was, I regret now the evil which I said I would do unto my people. When Moses heard this, he said, be it absolved for you, be it absolved for you. There is neither vow nor oath any longer. Okay, so this imagination on the part of the rabbis to imagine that that Moshe could absolve God of a vow and therefore save the people is certainly one way that you can change the divine mind. There's one more text, which, and I hope many of you are familiar with it. It's actually one of my favorite texts, and this is actually from the Talmud rather than from the Midrash specifically. This takes place after God has agreed to forgive the people. And God has called Moshe to come back up and write another set of tablets, and Moshe still isn't sure. He still wants God to kind of assure him that the people will be okay. And in the Torah, God says, "I'm going to put you in the. I'm going to put you in the. I'm going to put you in the cleft of the rock, and I'm going to pass by, but you can't see my face, but you're going to hear my attributes." And there it is. But the text in the Talmud, the Agadic text, is even stronger. It says, Rabbi Yochanan said, were it not written in the text, it would be impossible for us to say such a thing. This verse teaches us that the Holy Blessed One drew his robe around him like a reader of a congregation and showed Moshe the order of prayer, which is Adonai Adonai al Rachum v'chanu nerach apayim, right? We know that. He said to Moshe, whenever Israel sins, let them carry out this service before me, and I will forgive them. Okay, so we have looked at a number of ways in which we can try to change God's mind, and here it is by reciting a certain set of words. And simply by reciting these words, although of course I think we have to do it with the right feeling, but if they carry out this service, then God's mind will change. God will forgive the people. The, this particular text does go on to distinguish kind of what happens before Rosh Hashanah, what happens before Yom Kippur, and also raises for us the question of, is this something that happens to the community as a whole? Is it the community as a whole that has to recite this and is forgiven, or is it individuals? Okay. I want to do one more text, because before we get too confident that our various acts and intercessors can change God's mind and save us, there is a midrash on last week's Torah portion from Shlach Lecha, which reminds us that our own actions and weeping can also change God's mind, and that it is not always to our benefit to do things which make God change God's mind. And this is a well-known midrash, which teaches that the crying after the spies took place on the 9th of Av, and the Holy Blessed One said to the people, "You have wept a causeless weeping before me, and therefore I shall fix for you a permanent weeping for future generations." And at that hour it was decreed that the temple should be destroyed and that Israel shall be exiled among the nations. And in Jewish tradition, this date becomes significant, that that all, kind of all bad things happen on that day. Right? Gonna take a break from the screen, because I want to go into some really powerful material. But first, does anybody have questions or comments up until this point?
Nobody posted on the chat.
Nobody posted?
So if somebody has a comment, you might just unmute yourself and
Okay.
ask your question.
I see Fran, and then I see Sam.
Fran, you have to unmute. Fran?
You did for a second. Yeah.
There you go.
Okay. So on my first page of notes, you said you said at one point, compassionate should be good for us. Compassion should be good for us. That seems to me an internal contradiction. That if we're going to be compassionate, we shouldn't be doing it for our own good.
Well, I would argue. I would argue that at least in the midrash that I brought, we are allowed to be compassionate even if it's good for us.
Okay.
That it's in this case, if compassion gets good things for us, that's fine. It doesn't have to be totally altruistic, right?
Okay.
Ideally it is, but we're allowed to do good things thinking that it can bring good things to us. Anything else while you're unmuted?
No, that's it. I'll mute myself. Bye.
Okay. Sam?
Well, the thing that I had is it almost sounded like we were calling upon Moses or the patriarchs, matriarchs, or other prophets to intercede on our behalf. I mean, Moses was there with the people and interceded on the people's behalf, saying, God, you made a promise. Can you keep that one, please? Now, is there a tradition, for lack of a better term, more modern tradition, something from like after the temple point where rabbinic sources or something that you're aware of where they would call upon, can you, whatever matriarch or patriarch, intercede on my behalf? Or
So the answer is absolutely, right? We modern Jews have been taught that we don't have intercessors. We're not sure that we have angels or that angels have a role with us. But I think it's very clear here, and it will be even more clear in the last two texts that we're going to spend the second half of the class on, that there is a belief that intercessors can be very effective in changing God's mind, and doing things for us, although they're not always effective, as we're going to see. So while it's not necessarily such a comfortable idea, it certainly is very much in Midrashic and medieval Jewish tradition. Certainly the, look, it's our standard, standard high holiday liturgy calls on Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? And reminds God, well, do they intercede with God? Maybe. I mean, you're going to see the whole range of traditions. We have been taught that we are responsible for our own prayer, our own fate, and I think some of these midrashim offered that as well, right? You can do tzedakah, you can do tefillah. You don't need an intercessor, but there certainly is a tradition of intercessors. Right, and in some ways, I think we'll see that later. But in last week's class, where we talked about the question of whether Bilhah and Zilpah were matriarchs, right? One of the questions really is whether they ever did anything for anybody else in a certain sense. Is there any way in which they interceded for other people? You could argue either way, but that might be one of the reasons why they are not necessarily considered matriarchs in the same way. People have to be able to stand up to God or speak to God directly. Certainly in the Techinas, the women's liturgy from the Middle Ages, often we call on, one of the most famous is in fact the Techina of the matriarchs. We call on the matriarchs, we call on the ancestors to intercede, to speak on our behalf. And you're going to see that very powerfully in the next texts. Any other questions while...
Yeah. Ilana had a question or a comment. You have to unmute yourself, Ilana. You need to unmute yourself.
Okay. I think it's a very positive message for us that if we follow God's ways, and if we see that God sometimes changes his mind, it gives us hope for future situations. Like, okay, it's not the end of the world that things happen. Maybe God will change his mind and things will get better. And that's one thing. The other thing is that we follow also the example that if we decide to make a certain decision and then we regret it, like we decide to forgive. And it's very important to remember to be able to forgive even though we made a different decision in the past. So I find it very positive with all these examples about the way God shows that he is willing to change his mind, so we can learn from it.
At least in the mind of these midrashic rabbis,
Right?
It's a much more complicated issue, right? Some of us think it's wonderful that God learns throughout creation and throughout God's interactions with human beings. Others would say that makes God less of a God. The first midrash that I quoted, right, where the person says, "Well, isn't your God all-seeing, right, all-knowing?" And yes, the midrash answers, he is, but he has to act with what he has. I think I want to go ahead. Was there somebody else, Jerry?
I think
I just
that's
want to
everyone.
say that.
Oh, Marlene Kashish had something.
Okay.
Yeah, what about the use of intercessors like the Rabbeim or the fervently Orthodox? You go to someone for a bracha. What's the place of that in the...
I can't really speak to it. I'll have to think more about it. I don't know that much about it. I am of that generation that was taught we don't do that, right? Although I think, certainly we have a midrashic strain that would say, yes, we turn to rabbis to help intercede, who have a more direct connection. I think we struggle with that, and I think, as I said, I'm not presenting these texts as theology or philosophy, but really as a challenge. So I want to go ahead now. With what to me are some of the most incredible midrashim in the entire literature. They take us up to the heavens and they call on all of the ideas we focused on and on the questions that you asked. But these stories don't leave us comfortably settled with the divine mind. Both of them are from larger texts, and I encourage you to find and read the full Midrashim, even though it's going to look like I gave you a lot. And I am presenting these out of chronological order. So we're going to begin in Persia with Midrashim that may change your perspective, or a little bit of your perspective on reading the Purim story. And some of you may have learned parts of this text with me before, but in a different context. So this is from the Midrash Rabbah. All of the Midrashim that I've done tonight have been from the Midrash Rabbah, which is, as we said before, is actually a collection, an anthology of Midrashim that have been organized, but they come from a whole variety of periods. And the Midrash Rabbahs on Esther and on but certainly Esther is relatively late, and it is actually influenced by the Septuagint and by the Greek versions of the Megillah of Esther. So you'll find some of this material in other places. Okay, but this starts with Mordechai, who warned all the Jews. Everybody was invited to Achashverosh's party. And Mordechai warned the Jews not to go to the party of Achashverosh, but they do, and they open the door to another character I don't think we've met yet, but this character also has the ability to get God to change the divine mind, and that character, of course, is Satan. Satan asks God, right? He's the accuser. Satan arose and accused them before the Holy Blessed One, saying, "Sovereign of the universe, how long will you cleave to this nation who turn their heart and their faith from you? If it pleases you, destroy this nation from the world, because they don't repent before you." Said the Holy One, blessed be he, "What will happen to the Torah?" And Satan replied, "Sovereign of the universe, be content with the angels." God did indeed consent to wipe out Israel. And at that moment, why do I want this nation for whose sake I've wrought so many signs and wonders and saved them from all that rose up to harm them? Okay, so you see here that Satan has touched that place where God just says, how often am I supposed to put up with this? Right? Forthwith God said to the accuser, another name for Satan, "Bring me a scroll and I will write on it the doom of extermination." So Satan went and he brought a scroll, and God wrote the doom. And straightway the Torah went forth in garments of widowhood and lifted up her voice in weeping before the Holy Blessed One. Okay, so the Torah itself can be an intercessor for us. Okay, and the ministering angels cried aloud at the sound of her weeping and said before the Holy Blessed One, Sovereign of the universe, if Israel would disappear from the world, what is the use of us in the world? And apparently that doesn't make any difference. When the sun and moon heard this, they gathered in their light. As it said, I will clothe the heavens with blackness and make sackcloth their covering. Okay, so all of the forces of heaven are prepared to argue with God. And by the way, if you remember all the way back to the first class and some classes that I've taught about Moses arguing with God and saying, I'm not going to die, right? And God saying, yes, you are, right? Ultimately, Moses can't change God's mind in that way, although I think he does adjust God's mind. But these are all the same witnesses that came to try to defend Moses, and it didn't change God's mind. Okay? At that moment, we're going to meet another intercessor. At that moment, Elijah, of blessed memory, ran with all haste to the patriarchs and to Moses, the son of Amram, and said to them, how long, fathers of the world, will you be sunk in sleep and not behold the distress in which your descendants are plunged? For the ministering angels and the sun and the moon and the stars and the constellations and the heaven and the earth and the hosts are all weeping bitterly, and you're sleeping. And they said to him, why is this? And Elijah responds, because Israel took part in the feast of Achashverosh, and for this a decree has been issued to destroy them from the world and wipe out their memory. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob said to him, if they've transgressed the law of the Holy One, blessed be he, and their doom is sealed, what can we do? Right? So isn't that fascinating? We have spoken already about how Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are supposed to be our guarantors. They're supposed to remind God, and when their names are called out, they're supposed to remind God. But in this midrash, they give up. They say, what can we do? Which is kind of interesting. But Elijah doesn't give up. Elijah betook himself to Moses and said to him, "O faithful shepherd, how many times have you stood in the breach for Israel and quashed their doom so they shouldn't be destroyed?" Right? And we saw some of those texts. How will you respond to this trouble because your children are at a breaking point? Moses asks the question. He says, is there a virtuous man in this generation? Similar to the question, the statement about Noah. And Elijah says, yes, there is. His name is Mordechai. And Moses thereupon said to him, go and tell Mordechai that he may stand and pray there, and I will pray here, and we may together seek mercy for them from the Holy Blessed One. Which is an interesting idea, right? This shared prayer above and below. And Elijah said, faithful shepherd, a doom of extermination has already been made out for Israel. And Moses replied, if it's sealed with clay, our prayer will be heard. But if it's sealed with blood, what must be, must be. Okay, so there is this idea that God's mind can be changed, but in some cases it can't. Go and tell Mordechai. What did he do? He told Mordechai. Mordechai knew what happened. They start that whole process that we know of. There's another midrash. It gets a little start after the text that I copied here, but it's another one of it's tragic, but it's also one of my favorite midrashim. Having made the gallows, Haman went to Mordechai, who he found in the house of study with the school children sitting before him with sackcloth on their loins, studying the Torah and crying and weeping. He counted them and found 22,000 children. Haman put chains of iron on them and set guards over them, saying, tomorrow I'm going to kill the children first, and then I'll hang Mordechai. This is this pathetic moment. Their mothers brought them bread and water and said to them, children, eat and drink before you die tomorrow, and do not die of starvation. Right? Does the Midrash know Jewish mothers? But it's just so powerful to me. Because the truth is, in Jewish law, children aren't supposed to fast, right? But here we're going to see they're going to make the difference. Straight away, the children put their hands on their books and swore by the life of Mordechai, their teacher, saying, we will neither eat nor drink, but we will die while still fasting. They wept piteously until the sound of their crying ascended to heaven, and the Holy Blessed One heard the sound of their weeping at about the second hour of the night. At that moment, the compassion of the Holy Blessed One was stirred, and he arose from the throne of judgment and sat on the throne of mercy, right? Throughout here, and we have this image in the High Holiday liturgy as well, God starts the day on the throne of judgment. And the task of the one who will change God's mind is to actually literally get God to stand up and move to the throne of mercy. But God asks the question, what is this loud noise that I hear is the bleating of kids and lambs? And I didn't write the Hebrew in here, but it's from the Haftarah that we read on Shabbat Zachor, the Haftarah in which Saul has not gotten rid of all of the animals that belong to Amalek, and he has not gotten rid of the king Amalek. And in the Midrashic connection is that during that moment that Amalek had not been killed yet, he manages to procreate and have another child. But the line here, what is this loud noise that I hear is the bleating of kids and lambs? And Moses, our teacher, thereupon stood before the Holy Blessed One and said, Sovereign of the universe, they are neither kids nor lambs, but the little ones thy people who have been keeping a fast now for 3 days and 3 nights, and tomorrow the enemy is going to slaughter them like kids and lambs. And at that moment, the Holy Blessed One took letters containing their doom, which were signed with a seal of clay, and tore them out, and begins the process of saving the Jewish people again. So here we've met Eliyahu, who is our intercessor, and we've also met the children. The Jewish children also have the power to change God's mind. Is this going to go? No, it is. I didn't. Sorry. So, so you asked about intercessors. Sometimes the intercessors work. Sometimes they don't work. And sometimes it's the children, and sometimes it's Satan. I want to go ahead. With our last text, and I did not give you all of it. I only gave you the part that that talks about something which does change God's mind, perhaps. But the much longer text, I'm gonna kind of tell you a little bit, and then I hope that you can actually find it, because it is devastating and profound. It's from the proem, or the introduction to Echa Rabbah, Lamentations Rabbah. Again, in that whole collection, it takes place as the temple is being destroyed and the survivors are forced into exile. God's self, is weeping and calls the prophet Jeremiah to summon the patriarchs and Moshe from their graves, because God says they know how to weep, which is just an amazing line. Jeremiah says to God that he doesn't know where Moshe is buried, and God tells him how to raise Moshe. Similar to how Serach bar Asher, see, I managed to get her in all the time, how Serach bar Asher knows where Joseph is, and how to call up his bones. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moshe, they all weep together with God. And Abraham, in a very long section, pleads with God to forgive the people, to not make them go out into exile. The temple's already been destroyed, but do you have to exile them? And God says that the people did wrong. God calls the Torah to testify against Israel, and Abraham stops the Torah. God calls the letters of the Aleph-Bet, and Abraham stops them from testifying. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob testify to their own actions as parents and children, which is really fascinating to me, that it is specifically, you'll see in a minute, it makes sense, specifically around being a parent. But Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob testify to their own actions as parents and children. They testify about the Akedah, and Jacob testifies about all his suffering when he lived in Lavan's house, in order to have all the children come into the world, right? We studied that last week. And these children of Jacob will become God's children, Bnei Yisrael. Moshe reminds God that he was buried outside of Eretz Yisrael for the sake of redeeming God's flock, and nothing moves God to stop the exile. We have, now get a little bit into the text where you can see it. Right before this part that I have here is number 1. Moshe and Jeremiah now walk on the road with the exiles, and they're walking among the bodies of the slain, and even Jeremiah, who was a Kohen, the Midrash says, walked among the dead bodies. When the exiles beheld Moses, they said to one another, "The son of Amram has come from the grave to redeem us from the hand of our adversaries." A bat call came forth and announced, "This is a decree from me." Moses at once said to the exiles, "My children, it is not possible to take you back now, since so it is decreed. But the All-Present will soon cause you to return." And then Moses left them. Thereupon they lifted their voices in loud weeping until the sound of it ascended to above. So it is written by the waters of Babylon that there we sat down and wept. And I left off a little piece here. The missing text continues with a devastating description of the suffering of the exiles. Moshe prays that the people will be spared a cruel death, but even that is not to be. He further spoke to him, Sovereign of the universe, you have written in your Torah, whether it be a cow or a ewe, you should not kill it and its young both in one day. But have they not killed so many mothers and sons, and you, God, are silent? At that moment, the matriarch Rachel broke forth into speech before the Holy One, blessed be he, and said, Sovereign of the universe, it is revealed before you that your servant Jacob loved me exceedingly and toiled for my father on my behalf for 7 years. When those 7 years were completed and the time arrived for my marriage with my husband, my father planned to substitute another for me to wed my husband for the sake of my sister. It was very hard for me because the plot was known to me, and I disclosed it to my husband, and I gave him a sign whereby he could distinguish between me and my sister, so that my father should not be able to make the substitution. After that, I relented, suppressed my desire, and had pity upon my sister, that she should not be exposed to shame. And Rachel goes on to say, here's what I did. I gave her the signs, and we saw about how perhaps even the handmaids were changed. I lay beneath the bed, and I made the signs. I made all the replies. I did her this kindness. I was not jealous of her. I did not expose her to shame. And now here is the moment. And if I, a creature of flesh and blood, formed of dust and ashes, was not envious of my rival and did not expose her to shame and contempt, why should you, a king who lives eternally and are merciful, be jealous of idolatry in which there is no reality, and exile my children, and let them be slain by the sword, and their enemies have done with them as they wish? Forthwith, the mercy of the Holy Blessed One was stirred, and he said, For your sake, Rachel, I will restore Israel to its place. And then we have the beautiful promise that Rachel's refusing to be comforted because they're not, and God says, refrain from weeping because you'll be rewarded. There's hope for the future, says the Lord, and your children shall return to their own borders. So Rachel challenges God to be at least as human and humane as she was. God's mercy is stirred, and there is hope for the future, which comforts us to this very day. But did God actually change the divine bind here? I'll leave that for you to decide. And those are the texts I brought. So any questions, comments, thoughts? Those texts are a little overwhelming. I know they're just amazing.
I actually have.
Yep.
Are there some names that could intercede on for various things? Because it seems like this last one, there was mention of killing mothers and children, and Rachel is brought in.
That's right.
Because Rachel, who had such trouble, like other characters, had trouble conceiving.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Leah didn't sound like she had as much problem as the other matriarchs, as Sarah or Rachel. Mm-hmm. But I mean, is there some kind of, for lack of a better term, guidepost or generalities for these matriarchs or
sure.
patriarchs?
So the answer is I'm sure there is. I'm not familiar with it. But here you can see this was such a carefully crafted midrash, in which all the pieces and the themes come together, and certainly there are I'm sure in the Hasidic world and in other places where there is contemporarily a stronger intercessor tradition, that you would have teachings. These are certain angels you might refer to. These are certain biblical characters. The truth is, actually, if you look in like the Tehillah literature, it's not always consistent who you ask for what. So there's a lot of creativity. Again, I'm not an expert on intercessors, and certainly in contemporary usage, but it is part of our tradition, and as we saw in these midrashim, at least, it is part of it. But again, our actions also matter. It's not automatic. That God's mind is changed, if in fact God's mind is changed at all, right? It could all be God's plan without our impacting it, but that then raises free will issues.
Ilana, you have to unmute.
Okay. It reminds me of Avinu Malkeinu, because sometimes God acts like a melech, a king. Sometimes he acts like a father. So it's good to have both sides about God. Sometimes he's very strict, like a king. Sometimes he's merciful, like a father. So there is a connection.
Right. We have all those different aspects of God which get developed, and we have this concept of God moving from one throne to the other. And I think that's one of the wonderful things. I guess we all have to start preparing for high holidays, although we have to get through Tisha B'Av first. But we have those different kinds of, as you say, a lot of names for God, aspects of God that we speak to. And I think you saw in the different midrashim that I brought as well, that there are different aspects of God which are appealed to, right? God the lawyer, God the one who might be jealous, God who is referred to, who has compassion on children, on parents. So I think for me, I said this wasn't going to be theology or philosophy, but for me, these kind of midrashim really open for us the possibility of creativity, the possibility of looking at things in different ways and not getting stuck, and the possibility of change for God and for ourselves. I think I lean towards the God is not totally predetermined side, which leaves much more room for free will, but that God gives guidance, and God really wants us to follow the guidance, right? We don't want to have to change God's mind. So, anybody else?
I think
Yes.
Pam has a question.
Yeah.
Mhm.
First, I want to join Helene Davis wherever she is. It's beautiful. I know it's your background. Anyway, but in terms of intercessors, I know people go to specific rabbis' graves for, like, this rabbi, is where you pray if this is what you're looking for, and another rabbi for something else.
Right. But the danger you see is that even when you go to the graves, you're not always going to get what you want, and they're not always going to wake up the way that you want to. So again, just be open to the possibilities here. Anyone else? So I hope that over these past weeks you've had a chance to look at midrashim differently, to think of some of the important characters and questions, and see midrash not just as baba mises, and not just as sweet little stories, but as encouraging us to use our imagination, and as really challenging us to be very open and very creative, and read our texts carefully, You saw that so many of the Midrashim, in fact, all the Midrashim quote texts, and they say, read this line of Torah carefully. And how does it connect? And what do we do with it? Don't just read the surface, but challenge yourself to bring it all together. So good night, and I look forward to seeing you on the computers, I guess, again, and in real life as well. So good night, everyone.
Okay. Thank you, Stephanie.
And thank you to Jerry for being our educational coordinator.
And this has been recorded, and I'll try having Linda transfer it and put it up on the site.
Okay, great. And if you need the text, let me know.
Okay.
Good night.
Thank you.